Dear Alison Hillard, Excellencies, distinguished and reverend colleagues, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference. We all understand that the climate change has a moral dimension, most obviously in the way that its impacts have a disproportionate effect on the poor. As a result, religious leaders have been examining climate change, a prominent example being the Pope Francis encyclical De Laudato Si in 2015. I have had the honor as chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to take part in several conferences at the Vatican exploring this issue. I'd like to share with you today some thoughts on how we are contributing to climate change and what we can do about it from a scientific perspective. The IPCC is a UN body mandated to assess science related to climate change, its impacts and responses to it. It was established in 1988, and we provide a science base for global climate policy. Our first assessment report, which was released in 1990, provided a scientific basis for creating a climate treaty, that is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that was in 1992. And the recent special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius provided scientific base for carbon neutrality by 2050 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees relative to the pre-industrial level. The IPCC is policy neutral because it is an intergovernmental body drawing its 195 member governments from the UN and other international bodies. Today, I would like to share with you the state of the world in the context of a global effort for climate stabilization. A few days ago, I was watching one of the global news channels and heard a commentator proclaiming that we live in an age of promise. Many countries have recently declared net zero 2050 goals, but in his view, with little indication of how they would be achieved, so that for him, they were a series of empty promises. He's not alone in holding such a view. While there is merit in such criticism, which I think is healthy, but there is a bigger picture regarding the goal of climate stabilization, whether or not you agree to this definition of our time as an age of promise. I believe that national promises are important and meaningful, especially for achieving global climate stabilization, even more so if a promise is to achieve the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Every country has to reduce carbon emissions to help the world to achieve global carbon neutrality by 2050. Emissions of greenhouse gases increase global temperatures regardless of where they are emitted, who emitted them, and how small the quantity emitted. Almost every activity results in CO2 emissions. Our entire infrastructure is currently a platform for CO2 emissions. For instance, my attendance in this virtual conference requires electricity, which in Korea relies on fossil fuel for 60% of its generation. Every day I move and work, adding to the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, which will cause the temperature to rise, worsening extreme weather events, water shortages and food security, human health, involuntary migration, loss of ecosystem services, biodiversity loss and species extinction, and the risk of potentially crossing the threshold of irreversible changes in the natural system. Accelerating climate change, unprecedented in hundreds of thousands of years, is already eroding the very foundation of our lives and livelihoods. To be more precise, my life and my livelihood, and your life and your livelihood, and of course, those of our next generation. These were thoroughly documented by the 2018 IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. Our two subsequent special reports on climate change and land and on oceans and glaciers and ice sheets found that many species, ecosystems, and coupled human and natural systems are now near or beyond their adaptation limits, especially for a range of flora and fauna in terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. I am just one of 7.9 billion peoples in this world, but am causing this terrible damage to ourselves, and the rest of world's population are also damaging themselves and me through their emissions of CO2. I'm both the victim of climate change and its cause. Climate change is a self-inflicted injury compounded by cumulative injuries inflicted by each other on this planet. Our business as usual and habitual way of living is undermining the very foundation of our life support system and attacking our health, lives, and livelihoods. It is quite appalling to see that we allow this self-infliction and mutual destruction to continue for this long. There is a failure to see the connection between global climate change and personal suffering. We very often see banners exhorting save the planet. I support that goal, but believe it looks remote, leisurely, and laid back. Shouldn't the banner read, help me, help us? Mutual destruction would stop if all emitters in the world stopped emitting CO2. This would require global agreements for action, regulations, and institutions. You can imagine the challenges of implementing such joint actions on a global scale if you consider the challenges the policymakers already face for any action within their national boundaries. A carbon tax is politically a non-starter in many countries. Where implemented, its levels were in general found to be not sufficient to induce a shift in consumption and investment on the scale required. The energy transition will strand fossil assets with consequences for workers and local economies embedded with those assets. Failure to achieve an equitable transition would stop the energy transition. In infrastructure planning and investments, there's always a question of finding balance when deciding between technology, financing, jobs, carbon footprint, and distributional issues. How tough this work would be if it goes beyond national boundaries to cover the entire global community is quite obvious. And therefore, the promise of net zero 2050 is significant. It's the first step toward global joint action. Achieving net zero is largely about energy transformation. Energy accounts for over 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Last year, CO2 emissions dropped 7%. We had the worst economic devastation since the Great Depression, and for the first time, in April last year, the oil futures prices fell below zero, and 3.4 million lives have been lost due to the pandemic. Certainly, this is not a picture of emissions reductions in line with carbon neutrality. The climate solution, that is carbon neutrality, means emissions reduction combined with economic progress and well-being throughout. We are to decouple greenhouse gas emissions from economic development. This means rapid transitions to clean, sustainable energy that is already underway in many countries and industries. And it further calls for a step change in technological innovation in many critical areas. These include enhancing energy efficiency, material use efficiency, making low carbon electricity the main source for heating buildings and powering vehicles, capturing, storing, and utilizing CO2 before it escapes into the atmosphere, realizing the potential of clean hydrogen across many industries, massively expanding the use of sustainable bioenergy, exploring sustainable agriculture, and building the foundation for a circular economy. And investments for adaptation will have to continue regardless of energy transitions. While all these efforts are crucial and relevant to restore climate stability, I would like to point out that we are merely treating the symptoms using technological solutions to fix the problems at the end of a pipe. Often that solution creates other problems. We need instead to look at the root of the problems. How can we reduce energy and materials inputs, not just waste and pollution? And we need to consider sustainable consumption patterns. Moderated consumption, that is low energy demand, shows the most pronounced synergies and lowest degree of trade-offs with respect to sustainable development and sustainable development goals, as it is evidenced by the IPCC special reports. Low demand pathways would result in significantly reduced pressure on food security, lower food prices, fewer people at risk of hunger, by reducing or completely avoiding reliance on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Consumption entails a societal burden to the extent it generates costs unaccounted for by the consumer. Just as there is a call for corporate social responsibility, a parallel to this would be a call for responsible consumption. Recognizing that we live in a closed system will enlighten us to search for ways to continue our development within the boundaries of the services nature provides. While addressing the symptoms of the climate problems, our next task is to lay the foundations for development in a closed system, away from the model of a throughput economy, the one we have right now. This may be the lasting responsibility of humans in an age of promises. Thank you.